Hello, bonjour. I am Professor Scott McDermott of Albany State University, and I'm very honored again to be participating in the Académie d'été with the Fondation Saint-Omer. It's today, July 13th, 2020, as I'm recording this in my office on the East Campus of Albany State University, and the title of this talk is The Common Good After COVID, Balancing Private Rights and Public Necessities. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, my life has changed a great deal, and so has my thinking about a number of issues. This is the first time I've aired what's been on my mind over the past 4 months, and so much of what I have to say will be provisional and unformed. I hope that in our discussion on July 27th, to which I am greatly looking forward, you will correct some of my shallow misperceptions so that we can come nearer to the truth of the situation through honest dialogue. At first, like many people, and especially my fellow educators, I saw much to dread in the effect that COVID would have on universities and on education in the lower grades. I was also concerned about the near total and voluntary disappearance of the churches from public life and the possible results of this for American society in particular. Of course, I feared an unreasonable expansion of state power thanks to government-imposed emergency measures. Yet, I worried about how Americans' stubborn libertarian streak would resist all such attempts to halt the spread of the disease. Obviously, these are still live issues, and I hope that they will come up in our discussion, since these matters of individual and communal rights are especially relevant to the document I've asked you to read, John Winthrop's Arbella Sermon of 1630. However, in this preparatory talk, I've decided to focus on an aspect of the pandemic which I believe has been largely overlooked. The coronavirus outbreak represents the most significant opportunity in the past 100 years to reform the modern Western way of life, which has long verged on total insanity. I say this as someone who is painfully aware of the terrible suffering and devastating loss that many persons, families, and communities have endured and continue to experience. I devoutly wish that a vaccine will immediately be developed, and that it had not taken this horrible tragedy to get people thinking about what is wrong with our societies. As Franklin said, however, experience is a dear teacher, but fools will learn from no other. And I consider myself the chief fool in this regard. Nevertheless, I hope that since the epidemic has occurred, we will not fail to learn the lessons which we should take from it. My community of Albany, Georgia, was hit hard very early. Like many deep Southerners, I was prepared to take a very cavalier approach to the disease when I first heard about it. But soon that was no longer an option. In fact, I was shocked to wake up on March 27th to a text from a close friend informing me that she had just read in the New York Times that Albany had the fourth highest per capita infection rate in the entire world. Under these circumstances, our town went into lockdown long before most Southern communities, and all courses at my university, Albany State, went online. The fact that my 81-year-old mother, Patricia, lives with me, something I am not ashamed of at all, provided a strong incentive for me to be extremely cautious. Under the terms of the shelter-in-place order, people were allowed to leave their houses for only 3 reasons: buying groceries or other necessary supplies, working if they belonged to some essential profession, or exercising. I continued to teach online, but many of the administrative elements of my job disappeared, such as recording attendance, advising my student club, and attending many useless and unnecessary trainings and other meetings. So, although I was conscientious about staying in touch with students by email and phone, I found I had a great deal more time on my hands to read, write, think, rest, and exercise too. It was while riding my bike around neighborhoods in town that I noticed the first change in people's behavior. When biking before the pandemic, I rarely saw a living person who was not in an automobile, except for the occasional landscaping crew, because we Albanians are so busy, or else so debilitated from overeating or TV watching, that we cannot even mow our own grass anymore. Granted, we live in a subtropical climate in southwest Georgia, but the deserted streets always depressed me. Suddenly, in early April, I began to see people outside, walking dogs, pushing strollers, riding on golf carts. There were even some children playing, something I had almost never witnessed before in Albany. There were two simple reasons for this. The first was that exercise was one of the few activities still allowed, and it seemed quite safe with our wide streets and high temperatures. But more importantly, people had been liberated from American workaholism, and for the first time in their adult lives, they actually had time and energy to venture outside, rather than collapsing on the sofa after a long workday, followed by a southern carbo-loaded, fried and breaded dinner. The COVID-15 has become proverbial, but I actually know several people who have lost weight during the lockdown here in Albany, primarily from not being able to eat out. I believe there has also been a change in the way that people use the internet. That miraculous invention seemed to have degenerated into a means of delivering pornography, video games, fake news, and worst of all, atrocious cat videos on YouTube. But post-pandemic, we saw the huge surge in downloads of Zoom and other networking software, which actually served to build community. Thanks to Zoom, the internet became less of a monumental time waster and more a place to attend AA meetings, virtual church services, book clubs, or family get-togethers. I know of families that hardly met or even communicated before that have now started connecting regularly on Zoom. The technology has also enabled educational opportunities like this seminar to continue, and although a great deal is lost with the inability to meet face-to-face, much has been gained as people have learned to use the internet intentionally for healthy purposes rather than passively allowing it to take over their lives. In June, our lockdown eased and our campus reopened, although summer classes remained online. So I've been teaching online and writing productively on my book, but with the removal of distractions, I've also had the opportunity to embark on some additional reading suggested by my colleague Patrick, who teaches psychology. He lent me Compulsory Miseducation by Paul Goodman and Deschooling Society by Ivan Ilyich, among other things, and we've been meeting once a week to eat lunch in a big classroom several feet apart and discuss ideas. This fruitful intellectual sharing would have been entirely impossible before COVID. Although Patrick and I have been friendly ever since I came to Albany 5 years ago, we would never have had time for this dialogue while overwhelmed with the demands of our heavy face-to-face teaching load and large class sizes. And speaking for myself, I think the enforced isolation of the past few months has made me take opportunities like this less for granted. This may be true for others as well, in which case it would be another encouraging consequence of the pandemic. These books and our discussions have explained a great deal about the frustration I have felt as an academic in recent years, and also about my students' frustrations. Although the educational system in which we are all currently trapped has had such a brainwashing effect that I think few students are aware of why they are dissatisfied. Rather, they tend to blame themselves for their lack of interest and motivation, when the entire dysfunctional apparatus is in fact culpable. The problem cannot be separated from economic developments. It started with the implementation of compulsory universal schooling, something which was done with the best of intentions. In this country, the movement gathered steam in 1918 when the Supreme Court, in the case of Hammer versus Dagenhart, declared the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act unconstitutional. After that ruling, the most effective way that progressive reformers could get children out of factories was to force their parents to send them to school. The writings of John Dewey are quite clear about the progressive agenda: to detach children from the milieu of family and local community, which, especially in the case of immigrants or poor communities, progressives saw as backward and stultifying, and replace them with immersion in a school which was meant to become the student's total experience of life. It is undoubtedly true that compulsory schooling exposed some poor children of an intellectual bent to cultural opportunities they would not otherwise have had. Although we should not assume that such children's abilities would have gone totally unnoticed by priests, rabbis, or ministers, or ignore the existence of community bands, debating clubs, and theatricals as venues for talent, activities which have been largely taken over by schools and institutions of higher learning. It is also undeniable that most children, those without an academic calling, once forced to attend school, were immeasurably deprived of opportunities to learn practical skills, which formerly were taught by family members, neighbors, or by employers in non-factory jobs or apprenticeships. Rather than being empowered by constructive opportunities to learn from trusted adults things that they actually wanted to know about, children were now taught a variety of subjects, in most of which they had no interest whatsoever, by a distant authority figure whose energies were mainly absorbed by the problem of controlling large numbers of bored and alienated tots or adolescents, and who accordingly had little time to spare for fostering the gifts of their more academically inclined students. The British mystery writer Agatha Christie, born in 1890, said that the reason she read so much as a child and began making up stories was that she didn't go to school, and as a result needed something to do. She commented, quote, "I suppose it is because nearly all children go to school nowadays and have things arranged for them that they seem so forlornly unable to produce their own ideas." End quote. Cruelly deprived of formal schooling, Christie went on to write more than 75 novels. Most of my college students really want to succeed as they understand success, and some of them are even interested in history. However, after several decades of mandatory schooling throughout the U.S. and 12 plus years of elementary and secondary education, they come to me reading on about a third or fourth grade level. I have stubbornly continued assigning primary source historical documents, like the one you're reading, but I am now having to embark on a project to rewrite the documents in modern language so that my students can understand them. I've had to admit that right now they can't, although after long experience, most students are adept at pretending that they can. Another issue has to do with the creeping and now all-pervasive influence of the business model of higher education, which has two aspects. The first is the notion that students should have to go to college in order to learn job skills such as accounting, business management, and engineering, which have been added to the traditional liberal arts curriculum of the university. As a result, increasingly, there are many in high positions in the educational establishment who believe that the only purpose of the university is to produce skilled workers for the corporate world. And since students have been indoctrinated into this mentality, many of them have no goals in higher education, aside from getting a diploma as a passport to the corporate job, the house in the suburbs, the new Lexus, the timeshare, and the giant flat-screen TV. The other aspect of the business model is the belief that students, as tuition-paying customers, are entitled to pass every course and get their diploma as long as they show up. The result is relentless pressure from regents and administrators on faculty members to dumb down curricula, eliminate all academic standards, and replace classroom time with gimmicks like experiential learning, that is, unpaid internships that give corporations an early shot at exploiting student labor. Recently, the Georgia Board of Regents proposed a quiet revolution in higher learning in the form of a program of study to earn a certificate in financial transactions. This is meant to provide workers for Atlanta's corporate call centers for banks and other financial institutions. A student could earn the certificate without completing any of the core courses in the liberal arts required of typical college students. Now, this proposal brings us a step closer to reality by finally acknowledging the unimportance of the liberal arts in the minds of the regents. It would also mean that fewer students would be forced to take courses like history, so that my classroom sizes would go down and my students would be more motivated. On the other hand, I might be also downsized out of a job. However, the question here is why the Georgia University system should provide this training, and Georgia taxpayers should help foot the bill. Why can't Chase and Bank of America and the other multi-billion-dollar corporations working from Atlanta train their own workers to answer the phone? Why indeed can't businesses train their managers, and stores their accountants, and engineering firms their engineers? Why can't we make the university what it once was, what it was meant to be? A place to learn the liberal arts, defined as the pursuits that make someone truly liber in Latin, meaning a free man or woman, able to speak, to write, to reason, and to think. The answer, of course, is that universities have become giant corporations in their own right, with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, so that administrators and faculty too, although that is a lesser concern, will not lose their jobs. But once again, COVID has created an opportunity to reevaluate the merits of higher education. Lawsuits have been filed alleging that the jury-rigged alternatives to classroom instruction hastily devised last spring constitute breach of contract. Students are asking themselves if college is really worth it without football, frat parties, and the other communal cults that make the current arrangement somewhat bearable. This process of questioning must continue and should ultimately result in the restoration of the traditional university and the removal of all utilitarian courses of study meant to provide job skills instead of a venue to pursue and to contemplate the true, the good, and the beautiful. Such skills should be conveyed through apprenticeships or on-the-job training, and a student who passionately and exclusively wants to learn accounting should not be forced to appreciate art, dissect a worm, or read John Winthrop. Hopefully, this questioning will extend to the lower grades as well. My niece Lily is entering second grade this fall in the Nashville, Tennessee school system, which just announced that school is not starting until September, but that all children will be expected to attend school online for 6.5 hours per day throughout the month of August. Lily's parents are divorced, and they both have full-time jobs. If Lily is not in school, she would have to be in daycare, and at daycare they would not supervise her online learning. As a result, my mother is going to stay with my sister throughout August so that she can teach Lily. This is another step in the right direction for education. The only thing better would be if the online instruction disappeared and Mom were able to teach her granddaughter according to Lily's interests and inclinations without any interference. However, this highlights a huge obstacle to the removal of compulsory schooling. When women, at least middle-class women, had the option of staying home with children, homeschooling was more feasible. It still exists, of course, but is hamstrung with so many regulations by the educational establishment that its advantages are lessened. Today, we would say that either parent should be given this opportunity. But given the lack of jobs that pay a living wage in our post-industrial economy, this is barely feasible for most families and, of course, impossible for single-parent households. Parents today require compulsory schooling and often pay extra for after-school programs so that young children are made to spend their lives in school, just as former child laborers had to devote their entire childhood to the factory. This, of course, has the advantage, according to the business model of education, to habituating Lily and other small children to the relentless demands of a corporate job, so that they grow accustomed to coming home too exhausted to think, question, understand their own misery, socialize, organize themselves, or do anything more challenging than heating ramen and switching on the remote that controls their gigantic television. This seems like an intractable problem, but if any of you agree with me that our educational system must be reformed, perhaps you can suggest ways that it might be overcome. I haven't yet come up with many plausible solutions, but I do wish to suggest a line of thinking which, again, springs from the learning that COVID has brought, and which may create the will to address even these fundamental economic realities. Again, the major factor standing in the way of progress is the disappearance of blue-collar jobs that paid a living wage. When these jobs went offshore or were replaced by technology, this further weakened local families and communities, as well as organizations like unions. Now, factory labor was more routine and less empowering than the skills passed down in families that made their living from farming, craftsmanship, or other trades like millering or butchering. still offer a shared experience for different generations of the same family. Sorry, my screen just went into sleep mode, but it looks like we're still recording here. Good. Okay. But with the disappearance of factory jobs and the increasing elimination of small businesses by department stores, supermarkets, and national chains, many Americans found themselves with no skills whatsoever, no community support, and no hope of a job for which they were suited. Starting with the Clinton administration, they were told that their best option was to go to college and learn how to repair the high-tech machines which had eliminated the jobs they really wanted, or to work in the financial industry which still thrived, as corporate profits from offshore enterprises did make their way back into the U.S. economy. Many who took this route found themselves with no job and a mountain of student debt. Those ill-equipped for the collegiate path could find a service job at minimum wage, or increasingly become addicted to crack, crystal meth, or opioids, with perhaps the subliminal agenda of destroying one's brain or health so as to qualify for a lifetime of government disability payments. The election of President Donald Trump in 2016 and some events in the recent Black Lives Matter protests of the murder of George Floyd fed on the despair over this bleak scenario. On Boston Common, for instance, protesters defaced a sculpture of Abigail Adams, an opponent of slavery whose husband, as president, provided aid for the Haitian slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture. They also vandalized the famous monument by Augustus Saint-Gaudens, honoring the African-American Massachusetts 54th Regiment and its white commander, Robert Gould Shaw, who led these black soldiers in fighting for the Union during the Civil War. Such actions provide another telling indictment of our educational system, but on a deeper level they show that the anger directed at statues was not only targeted at symbols of racism. Rather, this was a generalized anger against a seemingly inexorable historical process which has produced total immiseration, alienation, and above all, purposelessness among ordinary Americans. Furthermore, I wish to state that the destruction even of Confederate statues, though amply justified in itself and a useful way to blow off steam, is not going to do a damn thing to change the real problem as I have described it. How could the experience of COVID-19 possibly ameliorate this situation? First, by disrupting international trade. This has not yet happened to the extent that is desirable, but perhaps successive waves of pandemics, which now appear to be brewing, will ultimately have that effect. Among Western nations, New Zealand's policy for stopping the epidemic proved the most effective, primarily because they closed their borders. Please understand, I am not opposed to immigration, especially where it is necessary for economic well-being or security from oppression. And of course, I would not wish to discourage the intercultural exchange of ideas. I am talking about the baleful effects of economic globalism on the quality of life in the West. A bride-to-be can now order a wedding dress from China and receive it within a week, I am told. Who knows, perhaps one manufactured cheaply using coerced Muslim minority slave labor. If this type of global networking becomes impossible due to epidemics, the same bride might employ a local seamstress to rework a second-hand wedding dress. The result would be probably more beautiful and certainly more meaningful, ethical, and authentic than the Chinese model. The seamstress would have a fulfilling, enjoyable, and lucrative profession which she could pass on to her sons or daughters, or to the children of neighbors. That dress might also be considerably more expensive than the Chinese version, however, and certainly if international trade declined, prices of most items would go up. However, COVID may have taught people that they can make do without many consumer goods that they have believed to be necessary for their well-being. In the early days of the pandemic here in the United States, it was impossible to get paper towels or toilet paper in any store. Mom and I had a pretty good stockpile of TP, thank God, but we were dismayed at the prospect of life without paper towels. However, we remembered that we already had some cloths made of synthetic rayon that could be rinsed easily in the sink and reused as napkins for weeks. Now we can get paper towels, but we use far fewer of them just for a few specialized tasks. One can only hope that if further shortages should occur, they will make it impossible to get disposable diapers, the most appallingly wasteful product yet invented by the mind of man. Couples that use cloth diapers for their children, which have been perfectly practical for billions of babies over the centuries, would save a fortune so that they could then afford higher priced but domestically produced and locally marketed consumer goods. States should insist on revising corporate charters to prevent them from taking their production processes offshore, and federal law should prevent corporations from migrating from one state to another in an attempt to evade such restrictions. It is true that the pandemic has exposed how vulnerable some small businesses are to the competition of national chains. Locally owned restaurants, for example, have been closing left and right. To some extent, this supports my point. Many people have no doubt found that they have much more disposable income since restaurants have been closed and they have had to, gasp, cook their own meals. Some people have probably developed satisfying culinary skills they didn't know they had. Perhaps they can now afford to buy more expensive but locally produced foods to cook at home, especially since it is no longer possible to go to Starbucks and sit alone sipping a $5 latte while desperately pretending to be part of a broader community. We need far fewer restaurants, but to the extent that communities want to protect local restaurants from chains, it is their responsibility to use zoning laws or other means to drive chains out of business. And if people with more time on their hands become politically active again in their communities, they may be able to develop even more creative solutions to strengthen and empower each other and their local economies. As Ivan Illich put it, quote, "I believe that a desirable future depends on our deliberately choosing a life of action over a life of consumption, on our engendering a lifestyle which will enable us to be spontaneous, independent, yet related to each other, rather than maintaining a lifestyle which only allows us to make and unmake, produce and consume, a style of life which is merely a way station on the road to the depletion and pollution of the environment. The future depends more upon our choice of institutions which support a life of action, rather than on our developing new ideologies and technologies. We need a set of criteria which will permit us to recognize those institutions which support personal growth rather than addiction, as well as the will to invest our technological resources preferentially in such institutions of growth." I am aware that many people have not had the same experience of the pandemic that I have enjoyed because of my privileged position as a university professor. The young women who have been delivering my groceries over the past few months, since I stopped going to stores, have not had the luxury of much time for contemplative thought. There's so much to think about and so many inequalities and idiocies to address. Nevertheless, it may be that the changed circumstances of life during the past few months have opened a space for new approaches, new solutions, and the will to actually try to change, for once. On the 27th, we will discuss John Winthrop's famous sermon on board the flagship of the fleet that bore the Great Migration of Puritans to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. A sermon which set forth his vision of the communities the Puritans wanted to create, to see what it can teach us in our current situation. There is much at stake in the way that we respond to this crisis and this opportunity. For as Winthrop put it in our actions, quote, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." Talk with you then.